Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is The Guest, me. I'm hosting this show, and I'm the guest on this show because I think this is the most important program that I've ever done on life, liberty, and Levin. It's a special program because the election is a handful of days away. In this program, we're going to move through history, we're going to move through current events, and in the end, I hope it moves you to be the Paul Reveres and the Thomas Paines that we need to win this election. I'm not a journalist. Most journalists aren't journalists either. But I'm not a journalist. I'm an advocate for liberty. I'm an advocate for Americanism. And that includes the Declaration, and that includes the Constitution. Everything's on the table, as the Democrats like to say, and they ain't kidding. The Democrat Party today seeks to devour our Constitution and our constitutional system. What the Democrat Party has threatened over the Supreme Court, the United States Senate, the filibuster rule, the Electoral College, is what they're saying is, we want to own the government, we want to own the Constitution, and you will bow to us, the Democrat Party. And we have seen this in tyrannies throughout the world. I want to remind you how important a person Donald Trump is, what a statesman Donald Trump is, what a historical figure Donald Trump is. I also want to remind you of how some of the greatest men who've ever served in the office of the presidency were treated by their own party, by the Democrat Party, and by the media. And so let's take a little look at history. There was a wonderful piece written by John Cribb the other day in The Hill, and he points out Abraham Lincoln and Donald Trump had a lot in common. It's a comparison that aggravates Trump's critics, who don't like to see the man they consider the nation's worst chief executive linked with the man widely regarded as the best. This may make those critics' heads explode, but there are some fascinating parallels between the two presidents, as well as some contrasts. For starters, they share the same political party. Lincoln was the first Republican president. Trump is the 19th. Both men were long-shot candidates. In 1860, Lincoln, like Trump, defeated a field of better-connected rivals to capture the Republican nomination and win the general election. In fact, Lincoln got slightly over 39% of the vote. Both men came to office with little or no government experience. Lincoln had served only 4 terms in the Illinois legislature and 1 term in Congress. Trump had spent 0 time in government. Trump, on the other hand, had far more executive experience. Before his presidency, Lincoln ran a 2-man law firm with a reputation for disorganization. He often stored important papers in his hat, and in the corner of his Springfield, Illinois office sat a stack of documents labeled, quote, "When you can't find it anywhere else, look in this," unquote. Both men experienced harsh reactions to their elections. In 1860, secessionists wore ribbons with slogans such as "Resistance to Lincoln and Obedience to God." Sound familiar? Lincoln governed during the most divided era in our nation's history. Trump is governing at perhaps the most acrimonious period since then. Both presidencies have been times of extreme media partisanship. In Lincoln's day, newspapers were closely aligned with the Democrat or Republican parties, and it showed in their reporting. In 1863, for example, after the Gettysburg Address, the Democratic Chicago Times proclaimed that, quote, "The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of Lincoln's speech." The Springfield Republican in Massachusetts called it a perfect gem, deep in feeling, compact in thought and expression. Lincoln, like Trump, was furiously attacked in the media. Newspapers called him a demon, a buffoon, a miserable failure, a disgrace to the nation. Quote, "The man who votes for Lincoln now is a traitor," one Wisconsin paper asserted when he ran for re-election in 1864. You can imagine what Southern newspapers wrote. Trump returns the media's fire almost daily, but his assaults have been a war of words. Lincoln's counterattacks could be more aggressive. His administration believes some opposition newspapers fueled treason, so what did he do? During the Civil War, federal authorities sometimes harassed or closed anti-war newspapers and even arrested editors. Lincoln did not author the suppressions, but he rarely objected. Lincoln, like Trump, developed ingenious and end runs around the press to communicate directly with the people. He managed to get letters and speeches widely published so voters would know his thoughts and his words. Trump has done the same with rallies, 90-minute press conferences, and his tweets. The Washington political establishment viewed Lincoln, like Trump,
with wariness and outright hostility. He was considered a rube from the prairies, clearly out of his depth. Trump is somewhat of a street fighter. His instinct when hit is to hit back twice as hard. In his younger days, Lincoln also was a scrapper. He once defended a colleague from an unruly audience by threatening to break heads with a stone pitcher. On another occasion, he came close to dueling a political rival with broad swords. With age, he became more conciliatory. As president, he sometimes cooled off by writing blistering letters and then filing them away without mailing them. No tweeting for Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, was a wartime president. Trump and his allies consider themselves engaged in a kind of soft war on at least two fronts. First, against the swamp, an entrenched Washington elite, and second, against a hard left insurgency that aims to radically transform the country. In both cases, Trump supporters believe he's defending the nation's founding principles. Amen. His opponents strenuously disagree. That, perhaps, is the area of comparison with Lincoln that matters most. Lincoln was fiercely dedicated to our founding principles, especially those in the Declaration of Independence, his favorite founding document, that we are all created equal, that we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He knew that as long as we stick to our founding principles, America can be a great nation. And in the end, Lincoln was judged and is judged as a great president. But there's more, as John Cribb points out in USA Today. Mr. Lincoln is already beaten. He cannot be elected, and we must have another ticket to save us from utter overthrow. That verdict came from the pen of Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, heading into Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign in 1864. Now, most Americans remember Lincoln as a hero and perhaps our greatest president. But when he stood for re-election, many in the media and political class viewed him as a loser. The odds weighed heavily against him. After all, no president had won a second term since Andrew Jackson in 1832. That was the least of Lincoln's problems. The Civil War had dragged on for 3 years, with horrific casualties piling up and no end in sight. Spring had brought carnage at battles such as the Battle of Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse in Virginia. War weariness had spread across the North. Critics called Lincoln a buffoon, a miserable failure, an insignificant man. Experts of the day said he showed very weak and foolish traits of character. A few desperate Republicans cast about for other candidates. They dreamt of running General Ulysses S. Grant or perhaps Secretary of Treasury Salmon Chase. Just about anybody but Lincoln would do. Disgruntled members of the GOP gathered in Cleveland to protest the, quote, imbecile and vacillating policy of the present administration in the conduct of the war. So they nominated John C. Fremont to run against their own party's president. Meanwhile, Republicans loyal to Lincoln gathered in Baltimore to nominate him. Their platform called for a constitutional amendment prohibiting slavery, but any cause for celebration was dampened by news of 7,000 Union casualties in one day, only a few days earlier at the Battle of Cold Harbor. While Lincoln reminded supporters that it was best not to swap horses when crossing streams, Northern pessimism deepened. And to conclude, Lincoln was losing in 1864. He was running against General McClellan, the general he had fired, the general from New Jersey. And he was expected to lose until they moved into the summer, and summer moved into early fall, and the Battle of Atlanta led by General Sherman, where Atlanta was burned to the ground and the march through Georgia to the ocean. That is what is said to have saved the Lincoln presidency. And then suddenly, Republicans began to back him and support him for president. Lincoln was still attacked, even after his re-election. Not until after his assassination would the Lincoln we know today be admired and promoted as he is. I want to show you a short clip, a short video of our president, President Trump, at Mount Rushmore. And I want to remind you of where he stands and his principles and his belief system. They're identical to Lincoln's. They're identical to Reagan's. They're identical to the Founding Fathers. And this is one of the reasons he is so hated by the same Democrats, by the same media, by the same never Lincolners, except they're never Trumpers, that exist in the Republican Party.